We are now at the point of the day where we're going to ask you to roll up your sleeves a little bit and do some work. At the same time, we are going to feed you lunch. So next, we're actually going to transition to some facilitated breakout discussions focused on the three topics that I think we've identified as central to this work moving forward. Each of you have been assigned to a breakout group. If you don't know which one, flip over your name badge, and there's a group number on the back of your name badge. As I described last night, the objective, the purpose of these sessions is to think differently, to surface areas and opportunities that may challenge the status quo relationship between higher education and our public sector partners. In specific, in this case, the context here is DoD's mission to recruit and to train as it intersects with the mission of America's colleges and universities. I'd ask our facilitators to come out just so we can put some, I know there are pictures up there, but I'm going to drag you out here anyway. Facilitating Group 1, Building a Continuum of Human Capital, is Terry Gerton. Terry's the president and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration, former active duty Army officer, and former we spent a lot of time together when you were in this role, Deputy Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of Labor's Veterans Employment and Training Service. Joining Terry in Group 1 as our government representative is Katie Helland, the Director of Accessions Policy for the Department of Defense. Facilitating Group 2, Workforce of the Future, is Brent Orell. Brent is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on job training, workforce development, and criminal justice reform. Before joining AEI, Brent worked for the executive and legislative branches of the United States government for more than 20 years, including leading the Employment and Training Administration at the U.S. Department of Labor. Joining Brent in Group 2 as our government representative, and this is going to be tricky because we have a Brent and a Brent, is Mr. Brent Parmenter, the inaugural Chief Talent Management Officer for the United States Department of Defense. And facilitating Group 3, Empowering Military-Connected Populations Through Higher Education, is Matt Amidon. Matt is a senior advisor at the George W. Bush Institute and former director of the Military Service Initiative at the Bush Institute, where he led policy and programmatic work on veteran transition. Matt is a colonel in the United States Marine Corps Reserves, currently serves as the assistant wing commander for the 4th Marine Aircraft Wing. Joining Matt in Group 3 as our government representative is Mr. Joseph Garcia, who's the Executive Director of Education Services at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So if we exit the auditorium through the back, rather than sending you randomly through this building looking for breakout rooms, there is a team waiting for you in the lobby who will direct you all to both the breakout rooms and the lunch that will be served in those rooms. Welcome back, everyone. At this point, I'd like to ask Kori Schake to bring her panel on stage. Moderating our final panel is Kori Schake. Kori is a senior fellow and the director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI, Kori served as the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She's had a distinguished career in government, working in the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. She's also the author, along with former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, of the book Warriors and Citizens, America's Views on Our Military. Kori's panel is composed of our previously introduced facilitators and government representatives assigned to the three breakout groups. And we've assigned this panel and Kori the task of really coalescing and reporting out some of the primary themes and insights from the breakout sessions, with a particular focus on actionable opportunities for future research, for partnership and collaboration. So with that, Kori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, my friend. So my fun is to give each of the three working group coordinators a chance to talk about what they heard from all of you. And then I'd like to give our government folks the opportunity to respond to that, and then draw all of you into the conversation about where impediments exist to good things we're trying to do, what we might be able to identify as models that can, with particular circumstances, be successful, and think together about how we advance these important issues for the Defense Department, for our veterans and military families, and for our academic institutions. And we're going to do that in 58 minutes and 31 seconds. So, Brent Orrell, you are an expert on the future of work. So maybe let's start with the fact that both military service and education are crucial conveyor belts into the labor force. What did you learn in your group?
So we started out, I tried to sort of set the table by saying that there is this set of common challenges that are affecting all three of the sectors that we're principally concerned with here, the military, higher ed, and business. When it comes to the issue of how we make sure we have the people that we need to do the jobs that have to be done. I talk about it in terms of being a trilemma. We've got a people problem. We don't have enough people. The growth of the workforce has slowed dramatically over the last 15 years. And we can see that showing up in the labor shortages and in the pressures that industry is facing, the pressures that the military is facing. So that's one of the three main conditioning factors that we've got to face is this people shortage. Then we have a skills shortage or a skills misalignment. I think it's a little bit of both. And each of the institutions has a different role in thinking about the challenge of skills. And we can talk a little bit more about that. And surrounding all of that is this rapidly changing technological environment that we're going to be looking at over the next 10, 15, 20 years, in which artificial intelligence and its progeny are going to be reconfiguring much of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Mostly, I think, for the better. So those are kind of the three main conditioning factors. I want to talk just a little bit about the skills challenge per se, because I think it relates directly to the relative contributions that each of these three sectors can make. We have, you talk to business, they will tell you we've got a technical skills challenge. We don't have people who know how to do all the things that need to be done. But we've also got what's called a non-cognitive skill challenge, which is the ability to manage and lead organizations. And I think that this is an area in which we can see some of the particular strengths of each of these sectors, business, industry, higher education, coming together. So it's a common set of problems. It's a common set of challenges that need to be addressed. And each of these sectors, I think, has a distinct role to play in addressing them. So I think one of the things that came out of the session most impactful for me was this idea that this is my third trip to Syracuse to study what's happening here with IVMF and the effort that the Chancellor has launched. And up until this time, it's been a very kind of linear one-way progression. We talk about the military coming down into higher ed and then out into industry. And I think the main thing that came out of the conversation that we had was the need to reimagine that, not as a linear one-way relationship between these institutions, but one that we kind of reimagine as an ecosphere of exchange between the institutions, so that the various strengths of each institution are being leveraged, so that, for instance, the very high quality, high level, non-cognitive, what are also called soft skills that are coming out of the military are being recognized and utilized and built upon within higher ed. Because that's the big gap that employers are pointing to, in my experience, has been we just don't have enough of that in our workforce. The notion that connecting industry to higher ed is not new. But the idea that industry and the military need to be talking to one another in terms of human capital development and training in a conversation with higher ed, I think is something that is new that really needs to be focused on. So a non-linear ecosystem, I think, is what we came out of this conversation talking about, with really thinking about how each of these institutional sectors, higher ed, military, and industry, recognize they're working with the same people, progressing toward the same ends of a stronger America, and trying to engage in a non-competitive and more cooperative kind of approach to the development of human capital together.
So it used to be the case that the military had a disincentive to talk about development of skills and career transitions because they want to keep their talent in the force. But I noticed the same thing that you just said, Brent, which is that increasingly it is a recruiting and retention advantage for the military to be able to talk to soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and defense civilians about where you go after you do your service and how the institution's preparing you to be successful for that service. So I think you do see that convergence.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think that it's, again, we think of these as being very distinct experiences, but I think the reality is that we need to, in this environment where we're going to have to be very agile in moving human capital around to meet needs, there needs to be much more of a sense of flow between them. That somebody who does, that serves the country in the military and gets additional training through higher ed is then still available to be part of the service ecosphere as it relates to the civilian side of DoD, as it relates to the active duty military, that these things, there's more than one way to retain the talent that we're all concerned with, rather than just, these are mine and I have to hold on to them. That's a very bad strategy. People move under principles of motion that are their own, and they're going to do what they think they need to do. So the question is, how do you work with them? And all of these institutions, I think, have to take that idea on board.
Thanks very much.
Yep.
Matt, how about your group?
First of all, I wanted to thank our VA friends for being there. And Brent, there was nobody from DoD in our conversation, so we decided all solutions resided in.
I think it's simpler that way. Yeah.
No, it was, listen, a lot of this is a continued conversation about the opportunities for collaboration, convergence, and integration. But I think it's always very humbling, and I was honored to spend the time with the people who live the work every day. And in doing so, we talked about the very distinct difference between being veteran-friendly and veteran-ready, or veteran and military family inclusive. And by that I mean, one is a poster on a wall, and one is a deep and functional and public investment, as evidenced by here in Syracuse, of course, as one of the exemplars nationwide. It is not just deciding to be one or the other. It is truly a deep dive investment into the second one of being veteran ready or military connected ready. And in doing so, we shared some examples of how to do that. But I share that under the context of then what are the shared goals of DoD and higher ed. And earlier today, we heard about the demographic cliff. We heard about the recruiting challenge. And these are not new. We've seen them before within the history of the all-volunteer force, but they're definitely real, and they're here and they're now. And we heard from our friends in academia about the demographic cliff and what they were doing to counter that. The risk is real for some of the more established institutions like Syracuse, and we have, I think, Dempsey's out there from Columbia. Maybe they can mitigate that risk by growth and scope and scale of programs and doing things like that. But I know one of the articles we were given before we came here was there's a risk of, I think, 500 institutions of higher ed being at risk, existential risk in the next couple of years because of that demographic cliff. And my point in saying that is then where is the alignment and the integration? And it was interesting where a lot of this, for those of us who've been in the veteran space for a number of years, These are continued conversations. You do get frustrated that they do continue and persist, but it doesn't make them any less relevant. And that is access to bases for our institutions of higher ed. And my point in saying that is I think it was our friends from North Dakota said, how do I get, there are some types of educational institutions that have access to bases around the country, and it's not a monolithic thing. But my point in saying is, how do they get on base to sort of just establish those relationships for people who are still serving to then engage in an educational development while still serving? Because a lot of the narrative is you serve and then you transition to being a veteran and then you go to higher ed. And I think it was Jared, you shared with us 74, so it's about 150,000 transition every year. 74% go to higher ed. So it's a very large percentage who already go to our nation's campuses, and that's a good news story.
Yeah.
But we then really spent a lot of time talking about further left or upstream, and I want to talk precisely about our 18-year-old high school opportunistic population, which is where how could we establish a relationship between higher ed, DoD/our recruiters, and then our leaders of tomorrow to say, hey, listen, if you join and do honorable service for 4 to 6 years and get out, and the exemplar again is here in Syracuse, we will guarantee you admission to the university, not to a specific college. But why not make public and functional that opportunity? And what it does require, I think, is, Brent, we've talked about this over the years, is sort of a leap of faith and the acceptance of risk that it's going to have to happen. It's not, transition's not a monolithic thing, it's an individual journey, but how can we do that service-specific, garrison-specific, or region-specific around the country? And I think for those of us, again, who've been in this space for some time, there used to be within DoD, and not throwing a dart here or anything, but it was an efficient way to engage with DoD through the former chairman's office of reintegration, which I think is no longer, but it was a nice way to just learn from, enact, engage with, and relate with the equities within DoD in a more comprehensive and coordinated way. So all that to say is our key takeaways were in the today construct, we are all responsible, academia and DoD and the rest, for narrative control. And what that means is
I was just going to say, that's such a buzzword. What do you mean when you're talking
so
about narrative?
I think everybody's generally tired of the hero-victim stuff we've heard for so long within the veteran community. A lot of time, your average American, your average young kid learns about this thing called veteran or service member from Hollywood and or elsewhere. You're either a hero to be lauded or a victim to be, regretfully to be helped in some ways. But the point is that narrative control is responsibility for higher ed and for DoD. Service to this nation is a pathway to opportunity. I think history has delivered its verdict there. Engaging in higher ed and educational pathways is a pathway to opportunity. That's what I mean by narrative control, and we can do a very good job of that collaboratively.
Boy, I think that's such an important point. What you can see in the data about veterans' unemployment during the early 2000s was that the narrative was, and it came from a virtuous place. It came from increased coverage and increased attention by the VA to post-traumatic stress, but you could see concern about that narrative took hold, that every veteran is damaged and could be a risk to your organization. Yep. You could see it in much higher rates of veteran unemployment, and you can see it now because the military is getting serious about prevention of sexual harassment
Yep.
and sexual assault. Influencers, mothers in particular, are worried about their children going into military service. So we actually, those of us who care about the integration of our men and women who've done service into our broader communities, really need to make sure that we balance the virtuous attention to the problem areas with the fact that these are problem areas everywhere, and it's important that the military is attempting to solve these problems. Terry, what did your group find?
Well, I'm really glad to have gone third because I think what we focused on was building a continuum of human capital, and it depends both on the future of work and the future of the economy and this pathway to success that Matt just talked about. So for example, both sides of this equation, the military and higher ed, are struggling with the why question. Why should someone join the military? Why should someone get a higher education degree? And the pathways to economic success are confusing in both directions. So we started to pose the question then, how can the military, the Department of Defense, and higher ed work together to both answer the question of why, but simplify the pathways? And so there are a number of challenges to this. We wouldn't have a problem if we couldn't define it, but some of the questions around challenges came up with the complexity of the payment system for financial benefits, the overhead burden of dealing with GI Bill payments and tuition assistance. It oftentimes exceeds their benefit to the universities. DoD has a culture, and Corey, you mentioned it. No, you're mine. I don't want to share you with anybody. I don't want to tell you about any other opportunities because you might leave. So DoD's structure is oriented towards that. Legislation sometimes prohibits things that we think might be helpful. And universities' systems themselves are decentralized, not federated, unique to communities, unique to states, and that makes it difficult for DoD to engage, but it also makes it difficult for the universities to engage because they don't have a common point of reference and standard. So some of the opportunities that we identified got to that credentialing and standards piece. Could the university within a state develop credentials or standards that valued military experience and training in a way that made them acceptable as credentials for enrollment, so that would send a very clear signal to military veterans that their training was worth credentials at a university, make it easy for them to enroll. But also then, could university systems themselves acknowledge the community college standards and then the higher ed levels to make that enrollment process simpler? Could there be more flexibility in program delivery across campuses, both virtually and eventually with the use of AI to simulate in-classroom experience, so that they could meet the military member, either active duty or separated, where they are to facilitate that engagement in higher ed? We also talked about making sure that universities have skin in the game for veteran student success. Here's specifically a couple of ideas where GI Bill doesn't cover the full cost of tuition. Can universities make up the gap and therefore really be invested in their veteran student population, as opposed to just seeing the GI Bill as a source of revenue? And then can there be metrics around student success at different universities that can be shared with both the VA as the benefit granting institution and veterans, so that they can make informed choices about where to go, to know that they'll be a valued member of that community, that their experience is credentialed, and that they can move into that university program with an expectation of success. Where we looked at opportunities on the DoD side, I think really interesting. Can DoD be the mobilizing factor for action on the university side? And if so, can they do that by investing in pilot programs that would test some of these concepts and measure their impact on veteran success? Do veterans who go through certain programs have higher economic outcomes? Do they have better emotional outcomes? Does the university create value by doing that? And we looked at, could FFRDCs, federally funded research development corporations, be the instigators of those pilot programs and the researchers that could then provide DoD evidence that might help with both either regulatory reform or legislative reform that help address some of the other obstacles. And I do want to mention one of my favorite little ideas. If we're doing sabbaticals for parental care, could we not then also offer sabbaticals for education, so that an individual's career clock stops while they're enrolled in that higher education, and it starts back up when they're back in the same way that we're starting to do it in recognition of parental leave obligations? And so that's something that we could explore to get to the issues that Secretary Rosker raised earlier about can you stretch the career timeline to intentionally allow time for and communicate organizational value of participating in higher education. So those are some of the things we came up with.
Outstanding. I feel like one of the deliverables we need to have from this session that we've been having today is Terry's list. I think we should actually have all of those. I was struck, though, at how many of them were DoD deliverables. And so, Brent Parmenter, Chief Talent Officer, how many of those sound reasonable to you? The example that Terry used on stop-outs for education, I believe the Department of the Navy is already experimenting with those kind of stop-outs for business, for education, for anything anyone wants to start and stop the clock, because that brings it improves the talent in the force.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about these issues? What would you like to see academia do to make sure that the talent that's in the DoD workforce gets optimized?
So, and I'll give you my answer from day 4 of week 2. First off, the whole conference between Syracuse, University of Tennessee as the host, and all the attendees and the conversations, both in the panels and this morning, have been phenomenal. I've already set up what I hope to be a bi-weekly session with Mr. Rotzker as we go, and be able to just continue to learn and listen through these problems. I think the list that we've talked about and the discussion that I was able to be in, and I know from the conversations previously, not just today, but previously with Terry and Matt over time, and a lot of the partners in the room, are where the answers are going to lie for us to land on what we're going to do. It's not going to be siloed just in the department. It'll be through taking a public-private approach to it, leveraging these partnerships. The directive that for my position came out, the internal memo came out yesterday, and it says review the way we do things now, develop a strategy for how we can do things in the future, and then implement those approaches on what we call talent management. And it has to do with everything from talent acquisition or traditional recruiting and delivery of people, and things like Katie's work and accessions. It has across all the services and civilians. It has to do with workforce development, so how you go upstream pre-hire and engage in the act of creating the talent you need, or taking your existing workforce and upskilling them so that they can do what you need them to do in the future for what you know and what you don't know that they'll be required to do for our country. And all of that has to be done in a way that accomplishes the national defense strategy and national security strategy, and continues to serve as a value proposition to the country to want to invest in their military. Not just the individuals to want to serve, but the country to want to bear the cost of having us around in case we need to break that glass and be employed, that many of us have done. And it's those big things that we're thinking about now, but it's the eaches as well, and how we not just equip the individuals. I know Justin Howes here from University of Tennessee, the professor of military science, this is very personal to me. He's my son's PMS is in his ROTC program at the University of Tennessee, and he's on the 5th-year plan. He might not have even made it in 5 years if it wasn't for Justin. So having that frontline person that helps the individuals get through it is phenomenal. I'm also the parent of a female soldier, and she was enlisted, and she got out as an E5, and she went through a lot of things you talked about. And so your comment hit home about it was different when I was a commander and had women soldiers in my unit, and how I worried about them versus a parent of a woman soldier in the service not being able to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And that was tough. And so how do we think about all those things, braid all that together, and come up with some solutions in about 90 days? So this, in not just 90 days of initial strategy reviews, but working with this team, I would say my reactions are the list is phenomenal. As I think this conversation is a start point, and I sincerely hope everyone can remain engaged in the conversation together, and we can work together not just across the agencies, across the different domains that are represented here. And let's go.
Yeah, we got work to do.
Yeah.
Joseph Garcia, as I was listening to Terry's list, I was thinking, actually, the right place for a bunch of these pilot projects isn't in the Defense Department, it's in the Veterans Affairs Department. How are you thinking about these challenges? What did you hear that you thought were good ideas we could potentially model, things we could move forward with that get rid of impediments to this kind of cooperation?
Sure. Well, I hear a lot about DOD and higher education as a partnership. If you add VA, then that's a collaboration. So I think we need to bring VA into the equation because there's a lot of things we can do better together, right? And we bring a lot of resources to bear at VA and Education Service, where I'm at. And even legislation, you know, I briefed the House a couple weeks ago, briefing the Senate next week, and VA is giving positions on legislation that I think most of it, a lot of it would impact higher education. And I see that as an immediate opportunity. How are we hearing your voice more directly? I mean, this has been a good way to do that here, but there are VSOs like the Student Veterans of America that Jared's involved with, and others that are in DC that promote those concepts in legislation. But I guess I'd be interested in more how higher education can have more of a direct voice on shaping legislation or defending legislation that maybe is not the right answer, because to Congress's credit, I mean, they're willing to listen, right? And so that's the whole point of testimony, is to give another perspective, in this case from VA, on legislation. And we either oppose it or support it with changes, right? So, but we're doing that, and I just feel there's opportunity. How can we incorporate what we heard at this event into more of that collaborative voice that I think would benefit ultimately the veteran, right, and the beneficiaries that are involved with the GI Bill. The other aspect, I guess, is working with my new friend here at the DoD side. How can we help with recruiting? Because we hear about recruiting challenges. So we know that there's a large percentage that enlist in the first place for the GI Bill benefits, right? Like always like the first or second reason, beyond patriotic reasons, why people enlist, like I did a long time ago. But then how can we help DoD with recruiting to maybe leverage that reason why people are coming in for the educational benefit more on the front end, but like we talked about at the breakout session, more into the life cycle, right? Right now we get military members when they're getting out, right? Transitioning out or when they're out. That's kind of too late, because upwards of 19% of veterans will not use their GI Bill benefits because they think it's too difficult to navigate, or they don't have enough knowledge about it. And that's 19% too many. So how can, again, collaboratively, both at VA, higher education, and DoD, how can we make sure that everybody who's earned that right, their entitlement right, the motto at VA is from President Lincoln's second inaugural address, to care for those who have borne the battle and for his widow and orphan. So it is the nation's ability to pay back those that made those sacrifices, some ultimate sacrifices, for their hard-earned benefits. So we want to optimize the GI Bill and do the best we can to support our veterans and their families.
Excellent. So I floated around into the 3 different discussion groups, and the thing that made me so hopeful that this gathering is actually a productive one is how much critical feedback I heard the panel chairs being given, right? About reasons that veterans don't get hired at JP Morgan or aren't successful when they are hired at JP Morgan. The way that we conflate thinking about the employment requirements and the marginal cost of hiring someone out of the enlisted ranks rather than hiring somebody out of the officer ranks. I would love, before we give the panel any more time, to hear from all of you in the audience any complaints you have about the nexus of veterans higher education and the Defense Department, because this is the input these people need to be able to solve these problems. So who's going to be brave enough to identify an exasperation or an impediment that we need to get out of the way in order to be able to make both academia and military service effective conveyor belts for Americans to their aspirations, to the middle class? Anybody? Nobody has any complaints? That cannot possibly be
Should
true.
we call on somebody?
Come on, my friends. Somebody brave up for us. No, nobody's gonna do it. Thank you, sir.
I think the problem is the status quo on both sides. It's too easy to say, not on my watch, not take the risks. I obviously know the Defense Department better, and as I said this morning, we run a personnel system that was designed in 1948 and with very few exceptions has not been changed. Talking to the Admiral, he served for over 30 years to 39? 38. That was because Secretary Rumsfeld changed the system for flag officers, but not for 06s, not for colonels. They still go home at an inordinate early age. And unless we can adjust the career content, the Admiral, I asked him when he made Admiral, it was at 28? 29 years of service. If he had been in the Air Force, given their career content, frankly, he would have made it at 19 years of service.
Okay.
So unless we can get some forward thinking, certainly on the DoD side, that could open up, particularly an officer's career, for the kind of sabbatic you talked about, similar opportunities for the junior enlisted, it's going to be very hard during the careers to find a way of DoD to benefit from the opportunities that higher education can offer.
Okay, that's a great one. And while the rest of you are queuing up to answer this question, I'll give you mine, which is that one of the things that people in military service really value is a sense of belonging and sense of community. And as they transition out of military service, for many, that goes away. And it goes away in a way that leaves them slightly unmoored. And this has both employment and narrative implications. I've been doing some research on the way extremist groups are targeting military servicemen and women as they transition out of service. And they don't do it for tactical skills. They do it because it legitimates their political ideas to have veterans involved with them, right? It's the gap between the admiration the public has for the American military and our veterans versus what it has for other, especially political institutions. And so very often when veterans come into academic environments, the academic environments are so atomized and rely so much on individual initiative that they feel a little bit adrift. And this carries over very often also to first generation college educated people, right? They don't know that that it's a good thing to go to office hours. It's not a bad thing to they don't know how to go for help. And it goes to the narrative because I noticed as the coverage of the January 6th insurrection, all of the early news articles were about veteran and military involvement in this. And there are two reasons for that. First, service records, whether someone has been in military service, is a matter of the public record. So journalists who were not defense journalists, that is the political journalists covering these issues, could find that out fast when they were on deadline. And second, they didn't have a baseline of understanding. The proportion of veterans involved in the January 6th business was almost identical to their representation in broader American society. And that is not the narrative you get in coverage of it. And that is going to have employment consequences for American veterans unless we figure out ways for, during transition, to sustain a sense of community or recreate it in our houses of worship, in our school boards, and in other places. And higher education has an enormous opportunity to shape that transition in an incredibly positive way for America's veterans. Anybody else want to issue a problem you have to solve? Yes, ma'am. Oh, wait.
I've been doing this work too long to sit there when you queue up frustrations. So, this is for Mr. Garcia and my friend Brent there. So at VA has a FACA for veterans in higher education. And it's literally called Veterans in Higher Education, but there are exactly, to my count, 2 members of that FACA that actually represent higher education. And then, to my knowledge, I understand Department of Homeland Security has a higher education advisory council that advises. The FBI has a higher education advisory. No such structure exists at all at DoD, to my knowledge. So as a suggestion, and when asked the question about, the education folks at DoD, who is it in higher education that you work with, the answer that I get back is, well, we talk to the American Council of Education, which is not higher education. It's an association of all of us, but it has zero ability to impact what any of us do at our institution. So as a suggestion, I would have the conversations directly with the folks making the decisions on America's colleges, campuses, university campuses. And because that I think is your most direct path to get to real change, the kind of change that we're talking about here today.
Can I comment on that?
Please.
Just, Mike, I think that's perfect. That's within the authorities of why they established the office I'm in, and I know we can set that up, but it gets to something we talked about in our group, which is, and I think I had coffee with Barb recently, and we were drawing this out, and it gets at a problem that we have fundamentally in DoD, for those of us that have been in it before, and you see it now, which is the value proposition you have to the individuals is one that involves 3 elements. You have purpose, value, meaning, and belonging that stays relatively constant. You have 2 other parallel ones that are in constant flow with one another. One is risk aversion, stability, and process adherence that we strive for. And the other is creativity, innovation, or risk tolerance. And risk aversion and risk tolerance are constantly in tension. I think that you'll increase the ability of the institution and the individuals within it, both uniformed and civilian, the more educated they are, the more exposure they have to other experiences than just internal ones, for example, will be able to add to the leg on the stool of creativity, innovation, and risk tolerance. And to Mr. Rotzker's point, get away from sustaining the status quo of risk aversion and stability and process adherence for the sake of process adherence. And so I'm all for that grouping that can help us think through not just how to help individuals access education, but then how we can culturally evolve and become a little bit better at those things over time.
So we have an advisory group that meets, but the acting undersecretary, to his credit, he asked us to form what we call an education roundtable. 8 people, in fact, one is here, Eric Ebersol. Is Eric here? There's Eric, from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So it is senior thought leaders that without the, I hate to say it, but the bureaucracy of the existing committee that's kind of very structured, this is just senior thought leaders, 8 people, 7 veterans, 4 flag officers, but 2 from academia. One, a college president in New Jersey, an Army veteran, former flag officer retired, at the president perspective. And then also Dr. Flores is the CEO of the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, HACU, so he represents, like 500 colleges. So it's senior thought leaders in academia, business, VSOs, nonprofits, to really try and think more broadly about optimizing the resources that we give to our veterans and how they can impact the community and the nation and maximize that ROI. So we started it a couple months ago. We have our next meeting in a few weeks. We're excited about where that's going because it's just more free-flowing, not bureaucratic, and we're really hoping that will really shape where VA is going in education.
Excellent. So I saw one more hand over here, and then I want to, 2 more hands, and then I want to spend our last few minutes. I have identified 7 do-outs from our conversation that I want to float for anybody to pick up in their own work and at their own institution. Yes, ma'am.
So hi again, Rochelle Ford from Dillard University in New Orleans. And I don't know how many other teaching schools, but actually my first teaching job was at UT Martin in the communications department. But as a teaching school, and this isn't a frustration, I think it's an opportunity, and I think that it's also an appreciation. So one, I'm appreciative to be at the table today because as a teaching school, primarily undergraduate, we're starting our first master's degree in nurse education, which will help with the pipeline of nurses, and we need more healthcare providers. But as a teaching school and also as a historically Black college, it's important to have a seat at the table in these conversations. And so many of the other institutions that are represented are larger institutions and predominantly white institutions. So it means a lot that we're at the table. It's also an opportunity to be invited to sit at the table on a consistent basis. As we heard earlier in one of the other sessions, that each of the departments were required to have diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility standards. Now it's just like we're challenging corporate America. Now it's time for us to make sure we implement those plans, evaluate them, and to continue to move forward. The difficulty for many small institutions, whether they're HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, or other teaching institutions, is the capacity to do right with resources. So I have a particular desire from personal reasons, being, working here at Syracuse and being a part of this amazing effort to be veteran and military family, sensitive and inclusive, but it takes resources to do that. And we're at smaller institutions, sometimes it's more difficult to navigate the federal government, to be able to be competitive for the grants in order to build institutes or to be able to have a capacity to build a network that would enable us to make the amazing impact that historically we have done, but we need to be able to continue to do. So I say thank you, but I also say that there's an opportunity for us to continue to remain at the table and to be inclusive of all different types and sizes of organizations so that we can make an inclusive impact.
Terrific. Last one here. You had your hand up, didn't you?
Thank you. Am I on?
Yes.
I'm Don Andrus. I graduated from Syracuse University in, relative to your time frame, the Dark Ages, and also relative to the topic of the day, I was drafted, so that gives you another idea of how old I must be. I think this has been a commendable event, and I commend the university, after my leaving it, for creating this institute, which I think is doing some really great things. And I think what I've learned over the course of the day here is that there are a significant number of challenges that you have. And in my corporate world, having been in the aerospace defense industry for 35 years, we would call these cultural changes, which are the hardest to do. And I think a couple key words are collaborate and evolve. And I think that my sense is that there could be a much better collaboration in what I would call the silos of excellence here between the VA, the military, the DoD, and the educational institutions. And we see that everywhere throughout the world, right? It's all about collaboration. And I think the second thing is the thought of evolving. This institute was created largely, I believe, with a focus on veterans and military families. And perhaps we ought to think about the collaboration between universities and the military and the VA starting before they actually become veterans. When we talk about, all the challenges of getting the younger generation into colleges, into the military, et cetera, maybe there's a collaborative effort that you all could think about and evolve that would start before people actually become veterans, when they're through the ROTC or whatever other mechanism is possible. And then carry that on, maybe with even the goal that let's not make them be veterans as soon as possible. Let's see what we can do collaboratively and in sort of an evolution of our thinking that would want them to be in the military longer, because it's going to be more difficult to get people to join. So just some different ways of thinking.
Thank you. So I thought I heard 7 specific things that we all ought to be thinking about and contributing to. And the first is, it would be wonderful to have someone, an institution like the University of Tennessee or Syracuse, who do it right. That is, who are veteran ready, not just veteran friendly, to explicate what that difference is, right? To be able to have a list, maybe even a checklist for universities that want to be veteran ready, that don't just want to, as Jason Dempsey said in one of the working groups, be Instagram deep in their commitment to veterans. What does that look like? We have many of your institutions are veteran ready, do create community, do have processes that help veterans navigate, and that help universities navigate the difficulty of supporting, getting the processes in place to support veterans. So the first is, I would love to see a checklist of what actually does veteran ready mean for an institution. And it would be really neat to be able to, the next time this group gets together, to road test that and see where it's working, where it's not working for your institutions. A second do-out I thought I saw, and this one does go to the Department of Defense, which is to clarify what it takes for institutions, right? That the overhead and the payment mechanisms help people understand how to do it so that it's easier for institutions to be able to, have access to a military base. Or don't give it to anybody, but giving it to some and not to others creates a sense of unfairness that I thought came out in some of the working group discussions. So DoD for clarifying how to navigate the Department of Defense so that you don't have 500 different university presidents coming to you with different standards, but that they also have an easier way to understand what you need legally and in other ways. A third, Terry's list. I feel like we all need Terry's list, because your group came up with a lot of very practical, very specific things that would help. So I'd love to see your group's list circulated around. Fourth thing, VA pilot programs. There were some very interesting ideas. They came out of Terry's group, but not just out of Terry's group, about ways that the VA can assist universities to do small experiments and see what's working for veterans. What kind of support do they need? Do they have any unique requirements, or is what works for veterans is going to work for everybody, and we don't need to give veterans special support in some areas, perhaps? Fifth, this issue of community. And every institution strives to create community, but smaller institutions tend to be more community-driven than larger institutions. How do we find a way to create community for veterans? You know, when you had 10 million American veterans coming out of World War II, you know, you had veterans organizations. Practically every town had an American Legion post or someplace where veterans could gather to talk to other veterans. Given how small the cadre of veterans is at any particularly large institution, how do we give them a sense of community? I think that's a really important area for us to think about, and it's absolutely cultural. It's absolutely cultural. Sixth, and Bren, you are to blame for this conclusion, because your discussion about reimagining education, service, and work as an ecosystem of exchange. What does the life cycle in that ecosystem look like for a young woman or man? How do we help them understand it's not linear and segregable, but there are back and forth pathways? I'd love to see what that ecosystem looks like. And I think a lot of young people in service and trying to think about transitions and the role that academia would play in those transitions would have no idea how to visualize that. And so we can help them with that, because that's what we do. And then the seventh was the DoD group that Brent was talking about, which is how do we create a way, short of a large group session like this, to be able to convey to the Defense Department and to the VA good ideas that academia has for serving the veterans community, or for things that need to get fixed that make it simply too hard for small colleges to be able to participate in the way the diversity requirements you are seeking to attain. That is, to have a force that represents all of America and that creates cohesion within that force. We need all those good ideas, and we need a conveyor belt for getting them to you, and so that you can pick them up or explain to us why they're not ideas that are going to work. Okay, we have 6 minutes and 22 seconds remaining. I would like to give these 5 outstanding panelists a minute and 15 seconds apiece to be able to say a closing comment, something you wish that the broader group would take away that's either important to you personally or you heard in your conversation.
What's important to me personally, we started the program on behalf of our 43rd Commander-in-Chief and his First Lady 11 years ago. We wouldn't be here without our friends at Syracuse IBMF. So I would just like to say a shout out to Mike, Nick, and the team, this building, Mr. Daniela. I think also we can applaud and celebrate the accomplishments of the last number of years. Everybody remembers the Sea of Goodwill and where we went. And when we first started our program, it was we must solve unemployment now. And now look where we are. We are talking about efficient, effective, and enduring integrations and collaborations that will endure to the benefit of veterans and military families. So I think it's, again, we're in the refined chapter of opportunity, but it's a wonderful place to be, and I'm honored and humbled to be here with all of you. So thank you.
Well said, Matt. Terry?
I think what I really take away from this is the culture change challenge. Every stakeholder in this conversation has to take a look at why their organization does things the way they do. DoD culture is incredibly difficult to change, but we have to think forward about what the new economy is going to demand, how DoD plays a role in it, how universities play a role in it, and the people in this room become the catalysts to change that. Because as Dr. Rosker has said several times today, it is easy to stay with status quo. It's safe, it's low risk, but we will fail for the future if we do that. And so we all have to put on our risk-tolerant hats and think about how we can really change what the expectations are, to change the expectation that it is okay to take an education sabbatical, that it's not just okay but valued, right? And to be able to articulate what kind of credentials and what kind of training will make you more competitive from a military perspective, and encourage that, and then have universities ready to receive that population in a productive way, so that this whole conversation doesn't start when an individual separates from service, but starts when they enlist or when they join, and that it is a career development. It's really talent building for the workplace of the future. So I think culture change is the huge piece of this and the hardest part.
I think from a workforce standpoint, the thing that jumps out to me the most is the need to figure out how to better manage the priorities of the DoD in maintaining force readiness with transition for people who are departing. Those are both incredibly important, and they interact with one another, and it's really tough to get that right. But here's why I think it's so important, and it really grows out of the interviews that I did up here with veteran students at Syracuse, which was many of these kids, they're not kids, they're now adults, but when they went into the military, they were kids who were already suffering kind of a crisis of purpose and meaning. Many of them, they weren't quite ready for college when they graduated from high school, and they didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't have that sense of direction of where they wanted to go. So they went into the military. And the military does an amazing job of filling that gap. You don't have to think about your meaning and purpose, because I'm going to give it to you. You know, you are part of this team, and you're going to go do this thing, this mission. But the meaning crisis is still there when people leave. And that's what I really picked up in the interviews with a number of the students here at Syracuse, was like, it takes time to make that journey. Even though you've had that meaning gap filled for you for a while, you still have to go through that coming back. And so, from my standpoint, the only way really to help resolve that is, I've heard move upstream or move to the left, and in Washington, D.C., moving to the left means something different than what it means here. But moving further up the life cycle to get with people as they are preparing for their exit earlier, so that we do a better job of preparing of people for that transition, because the consequences of not doing that can really be tragic.
Brent.
Well, I think this feels like a good start, but it also feels like there's so much left to do, obviously. And we originally came here I think collectively, with this cliff that's coming with the 18-year-old population in a few years, and we're all going to be in a much greater state of competition, and so that's going to affect all of our business models of how we do it, for that, what it means to government versus higher education versus industry. And if we don't push those three domains together, and the .orgs, .edu, .mil, .gov, and .coms all coming together, and finding where that Venn overlap is, because this is going to take us all to figure this out. So I appreciate the start of this, and I really am going to lean in on this group moving forward, and appreciate the continued engagement.
Joseph.
So having been a student veteran myself, I used the GI Bill. I would not be here without the GI Bill, so it's personal to me. And also the last 10 plus years before this job, I was in higher education as the vice president. So between those two experiences, talk about customer experience, it's not only for the veteran and beneficiaries, but those that support the veterans. That's why collaborating with the schools, colleges and universities is so important, because you help reach the veterans. That's our main goal.
Well, my friends, thank you for all you have contributed to our common understanding, to supporting American veterans, to supporting American businesses, and to supporting American higher education. And won't you join me in thanking the panel?